Good morning, friends, and good morning, esteemed panel with whom I have the privilege of interacting with today. Before I start the conversation, I would just like to give a brief introduction on Tyeb Mehta. Not a traditional bio, but just reading through the lens of different people. Um, Born into a family that is closely connected with the cinema world, as owners and operators of the cinema halls, Tyeb Mehta develops an early familiarity with visual culture. He begins painting film posters in his early years and demonstrates a strong aptitude for drawing. It is this yearning for a more action oriented process of capturing and framing a sequence that made him join the JJ School of Art in 1947, the year also of independence and partition, of freedom and violence, a duality that is etched in Mehta's practice. It is here at the JJ School of Art that he's exposed to the ideas of modernism, abstraction, and what a painting could convey through the means of line, form, and color. It is during this period that he meets M.F. Hussain, Akbar Padamsi, S.H. Raza, Abraham El-Khazi, V.S. Gaitonde, Ram Kumar, Krishan Khanna, and many others. These friendships provided the ground for an inquiry into what was modernism. Friendships that formed an organic ecosystem for critical exchange, commentary, sharing, and support. He marries Sakina Kagalwala in 1959, his lifelong support. Yusuf is born in 1954 and Himani in 1961. And here he has a family and friends, which in a way form his ground and ecosystem. His first exhibition in 1959 marked the beginning of his artistic journey, inaugurated by Abraham El-Khazi, who speaks about Mehta's art as not as the art of despair, but hope. George Butcher, in his foreword for a catalogue written in 1962, ascribes Mehta's unfailing ability to depict compassion to three important elements. First, to Mehta's profound sense of personal identity. Second, to his national origin. And third, to a voluntary exile, which is very important, and we're going to be discussing that. Geeta Kapoor writes in a catalogue of the vitality in Tyeb's work, which also has a poise that comes from the pain he incarnates in his figure. The figure is a constant element in his practice. His paintings, she goes on to say, are most impressive when he uses his monumental color architecture of forms to sound the echoes of that pain and to modulate its pitch and frequency in their complex dimensions. Be it his early expressionists' work or later minimalistic compositions, Mehta's works evokes a suggestiveness, devoid of direct action or message. They evoke tension, flux, and uncertainty. We can start the presentation. As written by Georgina and Uli Bayer, Tyeb's paintings center around a conflict, as they say, as a dream for peace broken up by reality. Tyeb's vision is not a fanciful one. It is adjusted to the rawness of life. It is honest and raw. Through this panel, Longing for Humanity, we attempt to unravel Mehta's search for an enduring language, a language that bears witness, persists, and transcends with utmost dignity and honesty. Taking cue from the ongoing centennial retrospective at the Kiran Nadar Museum of Art, the panel will look at Mehta's practice as an integration of dualities, of bearing witness to violence and chaos, along with the underlying endurance that withstands the weight of violence with resilience, humility, and deep compassion. On this note, I'd like to invite RoobinKarode the curator of the Tyeb Mehta retrospective, to share her experience and insight on the making of the exhibition, Bearing Weight with the Lightness of Being. The approach of which strikes a subtle chord, and with Nasreen Mohammadi's Waiting is a part of Intense Living, and Ganesh Haloi's Reciting Land. Both exhibitions tracing the enduring form as balance and rhythm, one of personal suffering and the other again of partition and migration. So, yeah,
Thank you. Thank you, Jesal, and thank you, India Art Fair and Charlene, for inviting me to this panel. And thank you, all of you, being here this early in the morning. Uh, Thank you for being here. Jesal, I loved your introduction to this panel, and especially the way um, that you have connected the vectors between three of my curated exhibitions, Nasreen Mohammadi, early one in 2013 or 12, and then Ganesh Aloi and Tyeb Mehta. And I would like to say that I am totally moved by all three of them in different ways. I'm very interested in when artists like what Charlene said, how does art happen or what makes art happen is, of course, a fundamental question and a deeper question. But I'm drawn to practices where artists make an inward turning, and they go into the interiority of their being, and they try to make a connection between the seen and the sensed world, the world that is yet not seen or unknown, and how that happens in their practice is a matter of duration. It's a prolonged way or a sustained way of engaging with phenomena around them, and that is when revelations of different kinds happen slowly. It's a slow process. And in Nasreen, I always felt that, being her student and close to her, that her practice was an art of slow evolution, but also a practice of slower revelations. So for the viewer or audience, it wasn't there instantly, and it requires that kind of encounter and engagement, or that kind of an empathy to really get closer to the work. And that intrigued me a lot, that how does an artist work with abstraction? How do they renounce so much seduction that is available in a visual language, which is a language of color, a language of form, a language of excess, a language of figuration, narration, storytelling. And here is Nasreen, who renounces all of this to really reduce everything, or rather reject everything in her life except the line. And then line becomes that form of a very sublimating meditative practice. Also, the fact that she was dealing with an afflicted body, and that afflicted body was always reminding her of the mortality of life, the impending death, so to say. And she had seen two of her brothers die with that same illness, and she lived much longer as an artist who, through her practice, was trying to make the connection between the known world and the unknown, so to say. And I felt that it was so apt when I was reading her very private personal diaries, in which I found a statement saying, waiting is a part of intense living. And if anybody knew the artist, she was always in this quintessential mode of waiting. She was gathering attention all the time. She was looking at things in a very different way. And what was very important for her, and I think it resonates with Tayyab and with Haloi, is this sense of emptying out. You empty out, you prepare, and you become a receptacle. You are receptive to something that comes in the form of knowledge, in the form of light, in the form of a spiritual experience, so to say. And that preparedness is very important, and therefore that waiting, as you talk about, is there all the time. It is a slow process. You endure it, you go through the struggle, you live with it every day, and then it becomes a practice of your daily life. And that is what I felt also when I did Haloi, when Ganesh Haloi, I looked at, I interviewed him several times, I visited his studio several times, and I realized a man who had gone through so much in life, from colonial impositions to being a refugee, to forced migrations, to Bengal famine. And there's a whole list of what the world in turmoil was at that time. But it never became a subject of representation for him. There was never a direct representation of that pain or that kind of a suffering. Instead, it got all distilled, and it just embraced a grace. It embraced grace and a kind of a gentility of expression, which is what I would term as, something that illuminates from within, and really carries those poetics of the image, or reciting land in very different ways through the poetics of the image. And coming to Tyeb, when I was really going through Tyeb's body of work, and very fortunate that we have under one roof in this exhibition more than 110 works of Tyeb Mehta, which is an extraordinary feat in one sense for any curator, who will art historically like to see the trajectory that Tyeb really was walking or choosing to for himself. And I had read a lot about Tyeb, not so much that is, I think he's underspoken in many ways, and a lot more should have come out. But whatever has been published was very concentrated on the idea of pain, and the idea of violence, and the idea of suffering, and the idea of partition, and many a thing. And I don't think Tyeb was the only one who really was a witness, who really went through partition and its trauma. There were many more artists of that generation who really, in fact, I see even generation after him, Nalini, for instance, talking about how she was 1 year old when that happened, but she grew up with stories of mourning more than celebration because of the partition that had really drowned the celebration of independence in many ways. And so this divided, this division and this duality and dilemma continued to haunt many of the artists of that generation. And Tyeb, for me, becomes extremely important because he goes through that, witnesses that. But again, it is not so much about a direct representation of it, or a kind of presenting it as a personal angst. Okay, it is so much about how do we really address it, and address this part of life by a process of distillation, by a process of endurance, by a process of really thinking about struggle as a part of living, and that kind of a endurance made me think about, the contrary impulses that Tyeb Mehta is always addressing. Life is made of contrary impulses, It is about living and dying. It is about struggle and, or let's say agony and ecstasy, as Michelangelo talked about. It is about these dualities that exist. And how do we then make sense of it? And how do we really make art not just a direct reflection of it, but a distillation of it, bring in some poetic grace to it, an acceptance of a different kind, and overcome this bearing of existential weight. So though we are all bearing some burden or the other in our lives, how do we really lighten it? How do we bring a lightness of being? And first encounter to Tyeb's was, oh my God, there is so much that there is in terms of what he carries as weight, or what he witnesses, or what he must have internalized. But more importantly, The vulnerabilities are important, but so is the resilience that he brings to his forms, you know. The kind of, what is it called? The kind of strength, the kind of courage, you know, to really free yourself is something that really excited me a lot. And that's how this title appeared in my head at some point of time. That it is about bearing weight, but it's equally about with the lightness of being.
On this note, I'd like to ask Yusuf, you know, how he reads this exhibition and this title, Bearing Weight with the Lightness of Being. You know, you witnessed his struggles up close as an artist, as a father. If you could just share.
Yeah. Yeah,
Hello.
thank you, Jesal, and thank you, Charlene and the India Art Fair for inviting me here to talk on Tyeb Mehta. I think the retrospective and this whole centenary year actually has been a time of discovery and uh, looking back and reflection for not only me but the whole family. And there's so many things that have come to mind, and I think the title of the show, you know, is also very illuminating. And my son has something interesting to add to that. Bearing weight is my father, and the lightness of being is my mother. So that is another interpretation I think that you could go on to, because my mother played a very important part in his life, which I will also talk about very briefly. So I have actually now written something for once, not coming extempore. So in line with your title, I have titled what I have to say as Bearing Witness, Holding Form. So it's a son's reflection on his father. And as I reflect on the life of the Tyeb Mehta, I recognize a life shaped by pressure, quiet, sustained, formative. Not struggle as an abstraction, but as a lived condition, experienced across three distinct yet overlapping registers. The first register was survival. Deprivation came early and it was real. Those early years were hard. There were long stretches without a fixed income, when survival depended on friends, on borrowed time, borrowed money, borrowed meals. Food often came through the generosity of others, friends like Ibrahim Al-Qazi, Hussain, Raza, Ramkumar, Bal, and many others. A wider circle of artists who sustained one another materially and emotionally over more than 50 years. But survival was not sustained by friendship alone. It was anchored quietly and decisively by Sakina Mehta. Before they were married, my father told her plainly that life with him would be difficult. Her response was simple: then we will starve together. That sentence carried more than resolve. It was emotional commitment and over many years material support as well. This left a lasting mark. Nothing could be wasted. Not money, not paint, not gesture. Economy was not a stylistic choice. It was a lived discipline. And I think this we can see in his work as well. In his first solo exhibition in Bombay in 1959, he sold only a few paintings, fetching, if I remember correctly, a few hundred rupees and all. With that modest sum, he left for London and took whatever work he could find. For a time, he worked in a hospital, often inside operating theatres. This is seldom spoken of. We rightly emphasize partition, but we rarely recall the time he spent cleaning blood-soaked bandages, disposing of surgical waste, listening to the cries of patients in pain, day after day. Pain there was unavoidable. I believe this experience shaped his understanding of suffering, not as something to be dramatized, but as something to be endured, without allowing it to erode one's dignity. The second register was civic and historical. His position as a citizen of India, a nation born in the violence of partition. And we cannot ignore that. But we must remember that his experience in Bombay was peripheral. It was not like the refugees who came from what is now, Pakistan. But it was in Bombay, in a sense, sheltered and exposed to the communal riots and not the migration that was there in partition. But he was not a distant witness either. It touched him individually. He saw its brutality directly, the collapse of order, the sudden ease with which one human being could destroy another. He often recalled a moment from that time. We're all familiar with it. We're barely 22. He watched a young man beaten to death in the street. That incident sickened me, he said. Its memory never left me. And this is also what shapes him. It remains with him, not only as an image, but as a moral fracture, an early recognition of how fragile civilization could be. In the decades that followed, he was shaken by repeated communal riots, watching brutality re-enter public life with disturbing regularity. He saw how quickly ideals could unravel, how the promise of a secular and equal society could be corroded by fear and hatred. These are all influences, and apart from partition, which was a one-time incident, and left as a memory, but that memory was again and again, brought to mind by all the events that sort of followed. It is in this civic register that the falling figures take on another meaning. They are not only existential bodies in free fall, they are social bodies, individuals, and a society itself caught mid-collapse, suspended between what has been lost and what has not yet been formed. The figures do not strike the ground. They hover, arrested, unresolved. This suspension mirrors a nation in the middle of an identity crisis, falling away from inherited certainties, yet unable to land on stable ground. In 1965, when he traveled to the borders of India and Pakistan after the 65 war, he witnessed its aftermath firsthand, an experience absorbed into works such as Dogra, 1965. What troubled him most was not brutality as an isolated eruption, like partition, but its recurrence, its gradual normalization. And yet, he did not lose faith in humanity as a whole. That faith was neither sentimental nor naive. It was quiet, hard-won, sustained. He bore witness without turning away and without relinquishing belief in human dignity. One of the first things he would do in the mornings was get up, have a bath, and read the newspaper. He was always in touch with current, events that were happening, and he meditated and thought about that a lot. The third register was artistic. His responsibility as a painter to give form to what he had seen and lived. This was the most sustained of the three, a daily discipline, a riyaz, perhaps even a form of penance. The question he set himself was uncompromising: how to confront violence without reproducing it, how to acknowledge anguish without turning it into spectacle. He did not believe violence needed to be depicted directly to be understood. On the contrary, he mistrusted expressive excess. Over time, he moved away from painterly turbulence not because feeling diminished, but because it intensified. Restraint became an ethical necessity. In this register, works such as the Rickshaw Puller series function not only as social testimony, but as studies in force and resistance. The figure is shaped by compression and torque, bent against the pressures of the composition itself. The body does not simply occupy space, it is formed by it. The ground pushes back. Labor becomes tension held under strain. A similar logic governs the recurring image of the trust bull. Energy is palpable yet contained. Power exists, yet movement is arrested. He often spoke of this motive in relation to the vast mass of humanity whose energies were bound by the divisions of partition. In the paintings, this condition is not narrated, it is structured. The bull's twisted body mirrors the torsion of the surrounding space. The diagonal functions not as action, but as restraint, a line that holds force in check. The falling figures extend this into an explicitly existential register. These bodies are suspended in perpetual descent. Free fall becomes a condition, not an event. Gravity is present, but resolution is withheld. The diagonal arrests the figure mid-air, fixing it within a fractured geometry. Figures and ground share the same instability. Across these works, the human body is never isolated from its context. It is shaped, constrained, and deformed by the very space it inhabits. Large areas of the canvas, often structured through the golden section, carry architectural weight. These expanses are not empty, they exert pressure. What emerges is a pictorial language in which ethics and structure are inseparable. The paintings insist that suffering can be acknowledged without being sensationalized, that form itself can become a means of endurance. Only much later did something begin to soften. His time at Shantiniketan came after years of carrying this weight. Away from the city in a more contemplative environment, he confronted the personal pain of his heart attack more directly and perhaps accepted it. This seems to have opened him to a more reflective mood and to the almost surreal world of the Santals. The work does not abandon anguish. It becomes more spacious. Forms open, silence acquires presence. The condition remains, but it breathes. It is this experience with the Santals and the Charak festival that opened him up to a mythic space where the bull transforms into the buffalo and the Maheshasura enters here. And it is here that I think Jyotindra Jain actually plays an important part in discussions and his investigation and his deep research into the myths and the stories that surround the Devi and the Maheshasura. But I want to end not in my own voice but with words spoken by Ibrahim Al-Qazi at the opening of my father's exhibition. It was published in the Theatre Unit Bulletin in 1959 and sounds almost prophetic. I quote, "Sentimentalism has no place in Mehta's work. If I were asked to describe his works in one word, I would say that they have dignity. In them, man is denuded, stricken, stripped of all elegance, charm, good looks, fleshly beauty, but he has not lost his dignity. He is famished, physically and otherwise, but he has not become groveling and grotesque. He is patient and enduring. He suffers. He accepts his suffering." That acceptance was never resignation. It was endurance, measured, disciplined, and held within form. And it is there, finally, that my father's legacy rests. Perhaps that is what this retrospective ultimately reminds us, that art does not stand outside time, it bears it. And in doing so, it asks how humanity can be held, measured, and endured across history without being diminished. Thank you.
Thank you. Very moving. Jyotindra Jain, if you could.
Thank you, Jesal, for having me on the panel. And I'm so pleased to be here because I remember a month ago or so, Yusuf and Himani were at a conference in Delhi where this was about Tyeb, and they both came to me and said, when Tyeb was doing his series of Mahishasura particularly with reference to the demon Mahishasura, a wonderful, brilliant series, they told me that he talked about you and my work, and I had, decades had passed from my having been in Bombay. I grew up in Bombay and occasionally met Tyeb, gave lectures, and once I didn't know that he was interested in doing a series of paintings, but he told me something about it, so I gave him uh, two papers. One was by David Schulman, a scholar who had done extraordinary work on the goddess and the buffalo motif, and another was my own. I have done about 10 years of field work only studying the mythological motif of Mahishasura and the goddess. So I had huge material of sacrifices, ritual, the victimization of buffalo, killing, and all the myth. Now, most important point that I want to make is that the Sanskritized myth of the goddess and the buffalo, in that the buffalo is always the evil, the, somebody who, the goddess wanted to destroy. But all the folk mythologies, in Maharashtra, for example, D.D. Kosambi, the famous scholar, said that the goddess marries the buffalo in certain shrines and she kills him in another shrine. In Tamil Nadu, for example, the scholar David Schulman has collected about 50 or 60 mythologies in which the goddess is infatuated by him. And taking a clue from that, I had done work in Gujarat and Rajasthan about 8 to 10 years, and I found every myth talking about the goddess luring the buffalo, marrying him, and then killing him. So the whole thing of deception of buffalo, and in the iconography, the goddess is supreme on top, and the nether level, it is the buffalo which is being killed by deceit. That she marries him, and so these myths are lying all over India of the relationship of the goddess and the buffalo. The whole thing of deception of the marginalized and the lower level at which the iconography shows. So Tyeb focused on that misery and agony of the deceit and marginalization of the buffalo. So it's the lower part of the standard Hindu iconography is the focus of Tyeb's work. I quickly read out a couple of things because I don't want to spend too much. When you speak extempore, you take too much time. So I just finished reading this and saying, so rationale of my being present in this panel lies Tyeb's brilliant series of Mahishasura painting, as well as my own nearly decade-long field work and research on the motif of the goddess and Mahishasura in Indian mythology and living ritual traditions, a work that I had shared with Tyeb in 1980s. I lived in Bombay. I grew up in Bombay, and Tyeb, you moved towards 80s in Bombay early. My father moved back in 1978. So yeah, so that's around the time when I had just finished my work on the subject, and I remember now after you told me that opposite Jahangir Art Gallery there was a corner, and we stood for almost an hour. I began to talk about this, and then I found out he had interest. So I gave him those two papers, and one of the papers was Murderous Bride, the myth of Devi and Buffalo Demon by David Schulman. So she becomes a bride and then she kills the bridegroom. So it's a very, very interesting work that he has done. And David Schulman published a book called Tamil Temple Myths. And I have published numerous papers on the subject in my work in Gujarat and all. D.D. Kosambi, the famous scholar, did work in Maharashtra. Now, interestingly, in the Sanskritized Devi Mahatmya, about 3rd century BC, 3rd century after Christ, the emphasis lies squarely on the annihilation of the evil Mahishasura by the goddess. By contrast, in widespread folk myths and rituals in Gujarat, Rajasthan, Maharashtra, as well as in several Tamil Sthala Puranas, the goddess is depicted as being infatuated by the buffalo. And in some narratives, she even enters into wedlock with him. Ultimately, however, she kills Mahesha, the buffalo, and the bridegroom, with whom, who was also an ardent devotee of Shiva. So, in one of the myths, when the goddess tells Parvati tells Durga to go and kill buffalo, she kills him and brings the head to Parvati. That time there was a crystal Shivalinga in buffalo's neck, and then Parvati was asked and ordered to do expiation because she had done something wrong, and it was Shiva who tells her that you have done something wrong and go and so it's a very complex myth which Tyeb was very interested in. As you were telling me that Tyeb had almost a whole library on the motif of the goddess and the buffalo. So this was very, very interesting. Tyeb Mehta's Mahishasura series, in Tyeb Mehta's Mahishasura series, the focus appears to shift towards the tragedy of Mahishasura himself. His delusionary victimization by the murderous bride, to use the David Shulman's phrase. According to some regional Tamil Salapuranas, the Devi is required to undergo expiation for killing Mahishasura, a devotee of Shiva. One of the central pertinences of Tyeb series thus lies in its articulation of Mahishasura's agony. These subjectivities remain largely absent from the traditional or canonical iconographies. When you see traditional iconographies, it's a very standard goddess killing the buffalo. So there's no feeling of subjectivity. And Tyeb, being a modern contemporary artist, he brings the feeling of that subjectivity in the face, in the head of Mahishasura. And then an important aspect of Tyeb's painting is the duality, Mahishasura's own duality, the buffalo and the human anthropological form of the demon Mahishasura himself. So Mahishasura residing, and if you look at his painting, the struggle between the two bodies being together, that appears over there, which I feel is very Kafkaesque in the sense in Metamorphosis, the dual, that pain of what Kafka has brought out so wonderfully in the story. I think this is what is happening in the struggle of the two bodies living together, and that I think is an important aspect, and of course the subjectivities, as I mentioned. I conclude by this line: the insufferable entanglement of two bodies, but that of Mahishasura and the buffalo comes to dominate Tyeb's canvases in many of them later on, in subtle yet powerful manner. The series appears to evoke questions of social discrimination, because buffalo worshippers were lower caste, so social discrimination, and above all, the pain of deception, victimization, and marginalization. So these are all belong to the cult of the buffalo worship, and then how it gets imbibed into Sanskritized versions, and then Devi is supreme, and so the whole issue of marginalization and particularly the issue of victimization, and especially, as I said, deception. These are the pains of that, and that part. I read Mahishasura series of Tyeb in that manner. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that was very insightful. And, taking a cue from this, if you look at a lot of Tyeb's works, you see interlocking forms, right? You see the bull and the human, the bull and the rickshaw puller. They're all entwined. The falling bird and the human figure. So I'd like to come to that series of works, and if you could talk about this interlocking of forms, and especially the ones that you see in the falling bird series, where it's a falling bird when it's actually, defying gravity. So can we talk about that? Rubina, Yusuf?
I think both Yusuf and Dr. Jain have so beautifully expressed many things about Tyeb's practice. And I think one of the most important thing that you brought about is this idea of the composite image. The image is so indivisible, as he arrives to it, that when you keep looking at his works, you start thinking that there is nothing that you can take away from it. You can't even move a finger here or there or a hand here or there in the way that he has compressed and created that concise image. And that kind of integration, that kind of conjoining, that kind of composite way of making is also to really bring together the duality within us. It's almost like saying that there is a man in the beast and there's a beast in the man, okay? And you could take these connotations further to many other kinds of interpretations that come because of this kind of bringing together or making of one image. And I'm very keen and very interested, and I'm really thankful to the family that they brought to this exhibition. They lent the early drawings and sketches, because if you notice in the exhibition, I have written in very, very big words the idea of painting as a struggle, and how in that process you also destroy to create. There is constantly this thing about, when can I come to that point? And in that process, a lot of elimination happens. A lot comes through erasure, a lot comes through understanding, a lot comes through minimizing and abstracting. And therefore, from the early works which had that earthy palette, which were heaving figures, very expressionistic and fleshy, raw brushwork, from there to retain a chromatic intensity, but to completely bring the kind of elegance and dignity to the work by making those areas flattened out. But as Yusuf said, they could be two-dimensional flat colors, but they are not empty of meaning. They're not empty of meaning. They are there for a reason. But I like that transition that he makes, where from something that he started with spontaneity and instinctive energies and rawness, and, even the bull image for that matter, then distilling it through geometry and through poetics and through understanding of how really to come to a language, a foundational language to talk about it, is for me very appealing. And when I started looking at the drawings which I have inserted in different rooms, I realized, and very closely I tried to study whether the drawing came first or the geometry came first. And I tell you, this is something that I very closely spent time, and I realized that for Tyeb, the process works both ways. So, to come to an enduring image, or to come to that kind of a precise image, takes you to an understanding, of course, that there has to be a structuring of the form, of course. But that structuring, it does also have an intuitive logic. It is not without intuitive logic. It is both. He is drawing those angles, okay? He is drawing the vectors. He is working out a geometry. But at the same time, from his own observations and intuitions, he is also trying to make a figure which he has recomposed or rephrased. Yeah, and then come to that kind of a. It's very interesting how a language an artist develops for the reason that for what they want to show. What you talked about, a subjectivity that comes in the form of expression, and in sculptures, yeah.
Only in his work that the agony, etc.
Yeah.
Why the sculptures are fixed.
Yeah.
Whereas he brings that movement, that subjectivity, because it belongs to modern and
Yes, yes, of course. So, if you look at the exhibition, you will find that I was trying to curatorially think. I want to make it non-linear. It's very important for me not to discard chronology, it's not totally discarded. There are early beginnings and early ways of expression, and then it goes into many other things. But just the constellation of images, which is a few recurrent motives and recurrent themes, is all that he needed to express the breadth of life, to express many emotions and many kinds of perspectives and dimensions that the life could have, And when you say the bird naturally is a flying object. It's something that flies. It's not something that falls. Okay? You see more falling figures, the falling bird, and it's very interesting how he brings this dichotomy and the dilemma of being. And as Yusuf rightfully said, it's not that the fall ends. They are caught in suspension. They're caught in a moment where things are unresolved. Okay, they are in that momentum. They are in that churning moment, and that has been something very quintessentially Tyeb.
Talking about the exhibition and the way you've presented it, you've given words to the rooms, and reading about Tyeb Mehta and interacting with Yusuf and Hemani, we all know about the 6 memos and how they, in a way, impacted his later series, and he did 3 works, based on the memos, and kind of, again, maybe it's just a organic way that you've designed the show, but I kind of see a correlation that you've presented the show as memos, with these words like precarity, duality, tenacity, community, So if you just want to talk about that a little, and then with that we can then just come to Yusuf after that, and where I would like him to talk about the 6 memos and the last works. Yeah.
So that's very interesting how you saw it. I didn't start like that, or didn't really think about it like that. But yes, I know that he was very, he really was inspired by Calvino's 6 memos of the millennium. One of them is definitely very much there, not as a keyword for me, but the whole idea of lightness. Okay, where you want to soar high and about the weight of history, about the weight of existential struggle and all of that, which Calvino talks. But for me, these keywords were extremely important as I was thinking about his practice and studying his works. And I feel that the precarity of existence, or the precariousness, has been extremely important, because his figures are always pushed at the edge. They are caught at the edge of, we don't know what that edge is, but they are at the edge, and they really occupy or are dislodged in a kind of a unstable ground. And that precariousness of life is something that is very overpowering, to take, for me, that started my conversation with him. I was conversing with him literally, and I found precarity was extremely important. Similarly was gravity, and similarly was duality. And just to say that it's not something that I planned, but most of these words end with ty or y. They just go through a range of. So I was thinking of mythology at the end as one gallery room, and which is where his whole rephrasing of iconography and really working with mythological themes is there. And so I saw it in a way. It was one way to really address the aspects that really form the core practice of Tyeb and what he communicates, or what he wishes to really bring to the world.
I'd like to take a few minutes, if I may, although I know time's up. But coming back to the composite image, that was your original question. We must understand that the composite image has been part of his practice right from 1956. It is the figure and the ground, the individual and society, where this individual is shaped by social forces which are unseen but are represented by the ground, and that is the composite. And you see that in the trust bowl, you see that in the rickshaw puller, you see that in the falling figures over there. So the scale is human. The forces are social human forces. But when he comes to Shanti Niketan, that changes. The scale goes from the social to the cosmic. And now you see it is the cosmic forces that are at play. And here now, where the trust bowl is passive and inert, Mahishasura is active, resisting, and yet knowing that inevitably he has to be sacrificed. But that does not deter him. He fights, he struggles, and now the two forces are embodied in the lion and the buffalo as representative forces. So you see actually these things. And then when you come to the falling bird, these forces are gravity and flight. And gravity and flight are no longer forces in that sense, they are values. And that is when he reads the 6 memos, and the 6 memos are again values which Calvino proposes, for future literature. And he is looking at those values not as images that it can translate, but as values that he can use. And that is what, draws him to them. It's very interesting that Calvino could not finish the 6 memos. They are incomplete. And this incompletion is actually echoed in Tyeb Mehta's work, that he could only do 2 out of 6. And it is now, in a sense, when you look back at it, there is an ethics of incompletion in all of his work. Whether it is the falling figure that is suspended and never, the actions do not end. There is no resolution. And in the 6 memos, the 2 paintings of the 6 memos, there is again no resolution. There is a question to be taken up by future painters. So,
Sorry. Yeah.
Hello.
So yeah, on this note, I think we'll have to.
Uh, falling figure, falling bird. This is about movement in his all his painting, and very important one single word which I would like to use in this context is his regard for diagonal. So there's a quote you have put in the gallery that is breaking out of the rectangle or the square, but as soon as you do diagonal, you are doing something else. You are adding movement. It's not static, and that breaking up of static situation into movement, that appears in all his series, and that thing, and he consciously not only even literally shows diagonal line in the thing, and that is breaking out of the static situation. That I think is say.
I think deserves many more talks, and I think the retrospective will lay the ground for that, for these conversations. So thank you, panelists, Yusuf, Dr. Jain, Rubina. It's been quite insightful and very different, opening up a new discourse and new avenues to look at Tyeb Mehta. Please, everyone, see the exhibition, the retrospective, and go with enough time. It's just beautiful. And thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Can we have a big round of applause for the panelists and the ISL speakers on stage, please?